When a retired schoolteacher walks across a gymnasium floor to hand Shaquille O'Neal a single folded piece of notebook paper, nobody in the room expects it to be the reason he stops speaking mid-sentence. It is Thursday, November 12, 2026, 7:40 p.m. The gymnasium at Rosedale Junior High School, San Antonio, Texas. The paper is yellowed at the edges, folded into a small tight square, held together for 40 years by nothing but its own crease. Shaquille O'Neal unfolds it, reads the first line, and goes completely silent. By the time this story is over, you will understand exactly what a 14-year-old boy once promised his future self, why it took 40 years for that promise to find its way back to him, and what a retired teacher had been quietly carrying in a locked desk drawer for 4 decades. Stay with us through this whole story. The gymnasium at Rosedale Junior High is decorated tonight the way school gymnasiums get decorated for occasions that matter more than basketball games. Folding tables draped in maroon and gold tablecloths, the district's colors. A banner strung across the far wall reads Bexar County Legacy Educators Dinner, 43 years of service celebrated in gold cursive lettering. Round tables fill the polished wood floor where free throw lines are usually painted, each one topped with a small vase of white carnations. Strings of small warm white lights had been hung along the exposed ceiling beams earlier that afternoon by a handful of parent volunteers, softening the gym's usual fluorescent starkness into something that almost resembled a proper banquet hall. The smell in the room is a mixture of banquet chicken, floor wax, and the particular dusty warmth of a gymnasium heater running on a cool November evening. A few hundred folding chairs scrape softly against the floor as people find their seats. Somewhere near the stage, a sound technician tests a microphone twice, feedback squealing briefly before settling. Along the far wall, a row of trophy cases catches the overhead fluorescent light, decades of district championship plaques and faded team photographs behind smudged glass. A basketball hoop, folded up against the ceiling for tonight's event, casts a long geometric shadow across one corner of the gym. Somewhere near the concession window, a coffee urn hisses faintly as a cafeteria worker refills it for the evening. Shaq had been invited 3 months earlier by the district superintendent's office. A polite letter explaining that Rosedale Junior High was honoring a small group of long-serving teachers retiring that year, and that district records showed he had briefly attended the school himself, decades ago, during a short stretch when his family was stationed nearby. They asked if he might say a few words about the value of teachers who serve for decades in schools nobody else pays much attention to. He had said yes without much hesitation. He rarely turned down invitations that involved teachers. Something about the request had felt like paying back a debt he could not fully name, the particular quiet obligation he had always felt toward people who spent their careers investing in kids who might never think to thank them properly. A feeling that had only grown stronger the longer his own career had gone on, and the more he came to understand how rarely that kind of quiet, patient work ever got the recognition it deserved. He sits now at the head table near the small stage, wearing a dark charcoal suit with no tie, his enormous frame making the folding chair beneath him look almost comically small. He turned sideways slightly to fit his knees under the table's edge, the same way he has turned sideways under 1,000 tables in his life. He had flown in that morning, a short flight from Atlanta, and had spent the afternoon at his hotel going over notes for the brief remarks he'd been asked to give, nothing more than general thoughts on the value of long-serving teachers, a topic he could speak to comfortably without much preparation. He had not thought much, in the days leading up to tonight, about the specific school itself, beyond a vague, pleasant recollection of a short stretch of his childhood spent somewhere near San Antonio, one stop among the many that blurred together after enough years and enough moves. 3 people at his table recognize the moment for what it is before anyone else does. Principal Renata Ford, 49 years old, sits 2 seats down, having personally organized tonight's dinner for the past 6 years. She had been the one to track down Shaq's foundation contact information, unsure until the RSVP came back whether he would actually show up. She wore a simple burgundy dress that evening, chosen deliberately to match the school colors, and had spent the better part of the afternoon double-checking table assignments and microphone cords rather than trust the details to anyone else. Beside her sits Coach Delvin Marsh, 61 years old, athletic director for the district for over 2 decades, who had coached Shaq briefly during that same short stretch 40 years earlier, and still told the story at every staff holiday party, embellishing the height difference a little more each year, insisting by now that 14-year-old Shaq had needed a specially ordered uniform simply to fit into the team's smallest available jersey, a detail that had grown taller and more dramatic with each retelling over the decades. And at the edge of the small stage, waiting for her turn to be recognized among tonight's honorees, sits Eleanor Whitfield, 81 years old, silver hair pulled back into a neat low bun, wearing a simple navy cardigan over a cream blouse, a pair of reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She has taught 8th grade English at Rosedale Junior High for 43 years. Tonight is, by her own quiet insistence, her very last event as a member of this school's staff. Her hands rest folded in her lap, still, composed, though anyone who had spent much time in her classroom over the decades would have recognized the particular stillness of a woman quietly working up her nerve. The evening moves the way these evenings move. A slideshow of black and white and faded color photographs plays on a projector screen, decades of classroom pictures, field day photos, yearbook portraits. The superintendent gives brief remarks. 5 teachers are called up one at a time to receive a small engraved plaque and a round of warm applause. Mr. Okafor, a shop teacher retiring after 31 years, is called up first, receiving a warm laugh from the room when he jokes that he's taught 3 generations of the same families how to safely use a table saw. Mrs. Delgado, a longtime kindergarten teacher, is called next. Several parents in the audience visibly emotional as she's recognized for 36 years of gently launching the district's youngest students into their earliest days of school. When Eleanor Whitfield's name is called, the applause runs longer than the others. Former students scattered through the room, now grown adults with their own children seated beside them, stand up out of their folding chairs, several of them wiping their eyes. She accepts her plaque with a small composed nod, says only a few sentences into the microphone about gratitude, and about how 43 years passes faster than anyone warns you it will, and returns to her seat. Shaq is called up shortly after to say a few words of his own. He walks to the small podium set up at center court, the microphone stand adjusted comically low for his height, and someone hurries out to raise it before he even has to ask. "I'm not going to take up much of your evening," he tells the room, his voice carrying easily without needing the microphone at all. "I just want to say that teachers like the ones we're honoring tonight rarely get told, in the moment, how much they're actually building. You're not just teaching a lesson plan, you're planting something that might not bloom for 20, 30, 40 years. And you usually never get to see it." He pauses, glancing briefly toward the row of honorees seated near the stage, his eyes resting for just a moment on Eleanor Whitfield before continuing. "I went to a school just like this one for less than a year, a long time ago. I don't even remember most of it clearly anymore. But I remember it mattered. I think that's true for a lot of us in this room tonight, whether we remember the details or not." He keeps the rest brief, thanks the district for having him, and sits back down to polite, warm applause, having no idea, in that moment, exactly how directly his own words were about to be tested. It is not until dessert is being cleared, the room settling into the looser, quieter rhythm of an evening winding down, that Eleanor Whitfield rises from her seat at the honoree table and walks slowly across the gymnasium floor toward him. She had watched him from her seat throughout most of the meal, through the slideshow and the speeches and the polite murmur of conversation around her, the small black handbag resting in her lap the entire time, her hand occasionally drifting to rest on top of it, checking, almost unconsciously, that it was still there. Twice she had nearly stood up early, only to sit back down, telling herself to wait for the right moment, rather than rush something that had already waited 40 years. She thought, watching him laugh warmly at something Coach Marsh said across the table, that he seemed entirely unaware anything unusual was about to happen, and some small part of her almost lost her nerve completely, wondering if it might be kinder, after all this time, to simply let the evening end quietly, and mail the letter instead. She carries a small black handbag in her left hand. Her steps are careful but steady, the walk of a woman who has crossed this exact gymnasium floor thousands of times over 4 decades, and knows precisely how far it is. Shaq stands as she approaches, the way he has been taught his whole life to stand when an elder approaches a table, ducking his head slightly out of old habit even though there is nothing overhead to duck for. His chair scrapes back against the polished gym floor, the sound cutting briefly through the surrounding murmur of conversation, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables before attention drifts back to dessert and idle chatter. "Mr. O'Neill," she says, her voice steady but quieter than it must have once been across 4 decades of classrooms. "I wonder if I might have just a moment of your time before you head out tonight." "Of course, ma'am," Shaq says, pulling out the folding chair beside him. Please, sit. She does not sit right away. She stands beside the table, opens the clasp of her small black handbag with both hands, her fingers moving carefully, deliberately, the motion of someone who has rehearsed this exact gesture many times in her own mind over the years. Her hands, weathered with age but perfectly steady, pause for just a moment over the bag's contents before finding what she is looking for. From inside the handbag, she withdraws a single folded piece of notebook paper, yellowed at the edges, creased into a small tight square, the kind of fold that has clearly held its shape for a very long time. I taught 8th grade English here for 43 years, she says quietly, still holding the folded paper in both hands. Every single year, on the first week of October, I gave my students the same assignment. Write a letter to the person you hope to become. I told them I'd keep the letters safe, and that someday, when enough time had passed, I would find a way to get them back into their hands. I kept that promise for almost every student I ever taught, she continues. Every single one, except for one letter I was never able to deliver. She holds the folded paper out toward him, resting in the open palm of her hand. This one has been sitting in a locked drawer in my classroom for 40 years, Mr. O'Neill. I believe it belongs to you. Shaq looks down at the paper. He does not reach for it immediately. His eyes move from the paper to her face. Confusion and something else, something closer to memory trying to surface, crossing his features. Slowly he takes it from her hand. The paper is impossibly light, impossibly thin, yellowed at every fold line, his own handwriting visible in faded blue ink through the top layer where the fold has thinned the page over 4 decades of being kept closed. The edges are soft rather than crisp, worn the particular way old paper wears when it has been handled carefully but repeatedly, taken out and refolded many times by careful hands over many years. A faint smell rises from it as he begins to unfold it, the dry, slightly sweet smell of old paper that has spent decades in a wooden drawer, mixed faintly with something that might have once been the smell of a 1980s classroom, chalk dust and pencil shavings, though that could easily be imagination filling in details memory alone could no longer supply. He unfolds it carefully, the way a person unfolds something they suspect might tear if handled wrong. The creases resist slightly, stiff with age, before finally giving way to reveal a full page of handwriting, a 14-year-old's careful, uneven cursive filling every line from margin to margin. At the top of the page, in the same handwriting, a date, October 14th, 1986. Shaq's eyes move down the page. He reads the first line. Then he stops. For 8 full seconds, Shaquille O'Neal does not move. He does not blink. He does not look up. His enormous shoulders, which had been relaxed a moment earlier, go completely still, the paper held motionless between both of his hands at chest height. 1 second. 2. Coach Marsh, beside him, notices first, going quiet mid-sentence in a conversation with someone at the next table, his fork lowering slowly back to his plate. 3 seconds. 4. Principal Ford turns her head, sensing something has shifted at the table beside her, her own hand pausing halfway through reaching for her water glass. 5 seconds. 6. Eleanor Whitfield stands perfectly still beside him, her hands now folded in front of her, watching his face the way a teacher watches a student's face when she already knows, with complete certainty, exactly what he is reading. A few tables away, someone's laughter rises and fades, oblivious, the ordinary noise of the room continuing on all around this one small, frozen island of stillness. 7 seconds. 8. Shaq exhales, long and slow. And when he finally speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper. I forgot I ever wrote this. But to understand exactly why a single page of 40-year-old homework could stop a grown man cold in the middle of a school gymnasium, you have to go back. You have to go back past 4 championships, past the doctorate, past every accolade a person could stack up in one lifetime. You have to go back to a 14-year-old boy who did not yet know what any of that would feel like, sitting in a classroom desk built for someone half his size. In the fall of 1986, Shaquille O'Neal's family had been stationed near San Antonio for what turned out to be a short 8-month stretch, one stop among many in a childhood spent moving base to base with his stepfather's army postings. He enrolled at Rosedale Junior High in September, already well over 6 feet tall at 14 years old, folding himself into desks meant for students a full head shorter. He did not make friends easily that year. New schools rarely worked that way for him. Kids stared. Some whispered. A few made the kind of jokes that were not really jokes at all, the kind designed to make a boy feel like his own body was something to apologize for. He ate lunch alone most days that fall, sitting at the end of a cafeteria table near the windows, working through a tray of food that never quite filled him up, watching other kids move in easy established friend groups he had no way into, not yet, not with only a few months before his family would likely move again anyway. He had learned, by 14, not to invest too heavily in friendships that had an expiration date built into them from the start. A quiet, practical wisdom that had cost him more than he ever let himself admit at the time. He kept a small paperback novel in his backpack most days that fall, something to read during the loneliest stretch of lunch period, though he rarely made it past a few pages before the bell rang. It gave him something to look at that wasn't the rest of the cafeteria, a way to seem occupied rather than simply alone. He remembered the walk home from school that fall, past a chain-link fence bordering a dry creek bed, past a corner store where he sometimes bought a soda with whatever change he had, counting the blocks the way a person counts things when counting gives them something steady to hold on to. He remembered his mother waiting at the door some afternoons, reading his face before he said a single word, already knowing, the way mothers know, exactly how the day had gone. Some afternoons she would simply hand him a snack and let him sit quietly at the kitchen table without asking a single question, understanding, somehow, that not every hard day needed to be talked through immediately. Other afternoons she would sit down across from him and just listen, offering the same steady presence she had offered him his whole life, letting him fill the silence in his own time rather than rushing him toward it. It was a small, unglamorous kind of patience, the same patience he would later find, without ever expecting it, waiting quietly on the other side of a folded piece of paper handed to him by a woman he barely remembered, in a gymnasium 40 years and one lifetime removed from that kitchen table. His stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, was stationed at a nearby base that year, home most evenings by 6, a man who believed deeply in structure and character, and rarely raised his voice because he rarely needed to. It was Sergeant Harrison who first told him, sitting across the kitchen table one evening after a particularly hard day at school, that being big meant nothing if he didn't stand for something, that how he treated people who treated him badly was the truest measure of who he really was. Shaq remembered that particular evening clearly, even decades later, the kitchen light low over the table, his stepfather still in his uniform, having come straight from the base without stopping to change. He hadn't asked many questions about the specific incident that day, a shove in the hallway, a comment loud enough for half the class to hear. He had simply listened, nodded once, and offered that single sentence, delivered with the same calm certainty he brought to everything, as though it were simply a fact of the world rather than advice. Shaq carried that sentence with him into Mrs. Whitfield's third-period English class most days that fall, sitting in the back corner desk, the only one in the room sturdy enough to hold him, listening more than he spoke, filling notebook margins with doodles during lessons that moved a little slower than his attention could hold. Eleanor Whitfield's 8th grade English class was third period. She remembered him, decades later, as a quiet boy who sat in the back corner not because he wanted distance from the class, but because it was the only desk and chair combination in the room sturdy enough to hold him comfortably. Eleanor herself had come to teaching somewhat by accident. She had married young, at 22, to a quiet mechanic named Robert Whitfield, and the two of them had tried for years to have children of their own without success. She took a teaching position at Rosedale almost as a way of filling a house that had gone quieter than she expected it to be, never imagining that the job would become the defining work of her entire life. Robert had been the one to suggest teaching in the first place, watching his wife grow restless during the long, quiet years of trying and hoping and disappointment that followed. "You've got more patience than anybody I've ever met," he told her one evening, "and more stories to tell than you know what to do with. Somebody ought to get the benefit of both." She started at Rosedale the following fall, intending, at first, to stay only a year or two while they kept trying for a family of their own. Robert drove her to the school on her very first day, waiting in the parking lot until she waved from the front doors to let him know she'd found her classroom all right. A small gesture of support, he repeated, in one form or another, for nearly every first day of school that followed for the rest of his life. Robert passed away in 2009, after 38 years of marriage, from a heart condition that had troubled him quietly for over a decade. Eleanor never remarried. She often told people, in the years afterward, that between her husband and her students, she had never once felt like her life lacked children in it, just children who arrived a little differently than she had originally planned. It was perhaps this quiet, unspoken longing that made the letter tradition mean as much to her as it did. Every October, handing out blank sheets of paper to a room full of 14-year-olds, she was given something close to what she had always wanted, a chance to invest deeply, year after year, in the future of children who were not biologically hers but who nonetheless carried a piece of her attention and care with them for the rest of their lives. Every October, for as long as she had been teaching by that point, Mrs. Whitfield gave her 8th graders the same assignment on the first Tuesday of the month. Write a letter to the person you hope to become. No length requirement, no grade attached to the content itself, only to whether the assignment was completed with genuine effort. She told her students, every single year, that she would keep the letters safe in a locked drawer in her desk, and that someday, when enough time had passed for the words to mean something different than they meant the day they were written, she would find a way to return them. On the afternoon of October 14, 1986, a Tuesday, 3rd period English met in a classroom with tall windows facing the school's front lawn, autumn light slanting low across rows of wooden desks. Mrs. Whitfield, 29 years old that year, wrote the assignment prompt on the chalkboard in careful cursive. Write a letter to the person you hope to become, and gave her students the full period to work in near silence, the only sounds the scratch of pencils and the occasional creak of a desk shifting under someone's weight. 14-year-old Shaq sat in his corner desk, the sturdy one, staring at a blank sheet of notebook paper for the first several minutes of class, the way a boy stares at something that feels bigger than the assignment technically asks for. He chewed the end of his pencil once, glanced briefly toward the window, and then began to write, slowly at first, then more steadily, filling the page with the uneven cursive of someone still developing his own handwriting. Outside the classroom window that afternoon, a groundskeeper mowed a strip of lawn near the flagpole, the distant drone of the mower blending with the quiet scratch of 24 pencils moving across 24 sheets of paper. A girl 2 rows over chewed her thumbnail, staring at her own blank page. A boy near the front finished quickly and sat rereading his letter twice, folding and unfolding it nervously while he waited for the period to end. Mrs. Whitfield walked the rows quietly that afternoon, the way she always did during the letter assignment, careful never to look directly at what any student was writing, giving them the privacy the exercise required to actually mean something. She noticed, passing his desk, that he was one of the last students still writing when the bell rang, his page nearly full from margin to margin. She had learned, over her years of assigning this exercise, to read the room without reading the words themselves, noticing whose pencils moved quickly and whose hovered uncertainly, whose posture curled protectively over their page, and who sat open and unguarded. His posture that day had been curled tight, shoulders hunched forward, the particular stance of someone writing something they weren't yet sure they wanted anyone else to see. "You can finish that at home if you need to," she told him quietly as students filed out, gathering their things. "Just bring it back tomorrow, and I'll keep it safe." He brought it back the next morning, folded once, and handed it to her without a word, the way a boy hands over something he isn't quite sure he wants read but trusts enough to give away anyway. She placed it in the growing stack of that year's letters, filed it into her locked desk drawer along with all the others, and thought nothing more of it beyond the ordinary satisfaction of another completed assignment, having no way of knowing, not yet, exactly how much that particular page would come to matter. Eleanor Whitfield had started the tradition herself in 1978, her second year of teaching, almost by accident. A student that year, a shy boy named Terence who rarely spoke in class, had turned in a letter so unexpectedly wise, so far beyond what she thought a 13-year-old capable of articulating, that she found herself unable to simply file it away with a grade and move on. She had kept his letter an extra year, then 2, telling herself she was waiting for the right moment, until eventually the right moment became a promise, and the promise became a tradition she repeated with every incoming class for the next 4 decades. Most years she managed it. She kept careful records, mailing letters to graduating seniors' last known addresses, tracking down alumni through reunions and yearbook committees, and in later years, through social media groups her own daughter helped her navigate. Over 4 decades, she estimated she had personally returned somewhere close to 1,100 letters to former students, watching, more than once, as a grown adult read their own 14-year-old handwriting and burst into unexpected tears in a school parking lot. She kept a small paper ledger in her desk drawer alongside the letters themselves, a simple list of names and years, checked off one by one as each letter finally found its way home. By the time of her retirement, that ledger ran nearly 40 pages, names crossed off in blue ink, a handful still marked with a small pencil question mark beside them, students she had never managed to track down at all. Shaquille O'Neal's name, for 40 years, sat among that small handful of unanswered question marks. But Shaquille O'Neal's family moved again in the spring of 1987, transferred to another posting before the school year even finished, the way military families often moved with little warning and less sentimentality about it. There was no forwarding address left with the school office. There rarely was, in those years, for families constantly in motion. Eleanor remembered noticing his empty desk one Monday morning in March, assuming at first he was simply out sick, only learning by that Friday, from the front office, that the family had already relocated. She remembered feeling a small, specific pang of regret that she hadn't had the chance to say a proper goodbye, a feeling she would carry, in one form or another, for the next 4 decades. Mrs. Whitfield had tucked his letter into the same locked drawer as all the others, fully intending to track him down eventually the way she tracked down everyone else. But as the years passed, and as Shaquille O'Neal became, improbably, one of the most famous people in the entire world, the task of simply reaching out began to feel impossible in a way it never had with any other student. How does a retired schoolteacher just call up someone that famous? She would say to herself for years afterward, and ask for a moment to give him back a piece of homework from when he was 14. So the letters stayed. Year after year, decade after decade, tucked in the back of a locked drawer, moved carefully from her old classroom to her new one when the school renovated in 2003, carried home once during a scare when the building's pipes burst and half the faculty's belongings were relocated overnight, always kept safe, always kept close, always representing the one unfinished promise of an otherwise remarkably complete career. The pipe burst happened in February of 2011, a Saturday morning, when a maintenance worker doing his weekend rounds noticed water pooling under the door of the East Wing classrooms. Eleanor received a call at home just after 9 that morning and drove to the school immediately, arriving to find 2 custodians already wading through an inch of standing water, carrying boxes of classroom materials out to the covered walkway as fast as they could manage. She went straight for her desk, ignoring her own coat rack and the box of personal supplies she kept for the classroom's reading corner, and pulled the locked drawer free from its frame entirely, carrying the whole thing, drawer and all, out to her car rather than risk even a few minutes of exposure to the rising water. She kept that drawer on her own dining room table for 6 weeks while the classroom was repaired, checking on it, she admitted later, far more often than the situation strictly required. "I told myself I was being sensible," she said once, recounting the story to a colleague years afterward. "But if I'm honest, I think some part of me understood, even then, that there was one letter in that drawer I still hadn't finished my job with. I wasn't going to let water damage take that choice away from me before I'd had the chance to make it myself." She thought about it every October, when the new assignment went out to a fresh class of 14-year-olds. She thought about it every time a former student's letter finally found its way home. And she thought about it most of all in the final months leading up to her retirement, when she understood, with growing certainty, that if she did not find a way to close this one particular circle now, she likely never would. The week before the retirement dinner, Eleanor sat alone at her own kitchen table one evening, the locked drawer's contents spread carefully in front of her as she packed up the last of her classroom materials, the folded letter set apart from the rest, exactly where it had sat, in one drawer or another, for 40 years. She had drafted, in her mind, at least a dozen different ways this might go. She imagined writing him a letter of her own first, explaining everything gently before ever showing up in person. She imagined mailing the original letter quietly through his foundation's office, without ever meeting him at all, avoiding the risk of an uncomfortable moment entirely. She imagined, more than once, simply letting the drawer stay locked forever, telling herself that some promises were allowed to remain unfinished, that surely a woman who had kept nearly 1,100 other promises could be forgiven for the one that got away. But each time she considered simply letting it go, she found herself thinking of the exact sentence she had read aloud nearly 40 times over 4 decades, about making being different feel less lonely for somebody else. And she understood, with quiet clarity, that she owed the author of that sentence the same kindness he had unknowingly extended to thousands of strangers. She decided, finally, on the Tuesday before the dinner, that she would simply carry the letter with her, and trust that the right moment would present itself the way it so often had across 43 years of teaching. A small, quiet act of faith from a woman who had spent her entire career teaching exactly that kind of faith to everyone else. Renata Ford had become principal at Rosedale Junior High 6 years earlier, After teaching social studies in the same building for over a decade under Eleanor Whitfield's watchful, generous mentorship, she had heard the story of the locked drawer many times over the years, always in passing, always told with the same small note of unfinished business in Mrs. Whitfield's voice. Eleanor had been the one to talk Renata through her own hardest year as a young teacher, back when Renata had considered leaving education altogether after a particularly brutal first semester. Sitting with her after school on more evenings than either of them could now count, listening more than advising, the same quiet steadiness she had offered hundreds of students over the decades. Renata often said, privately, that she owed her entire career to Eleanor Whitfield's patience, and that becoming principal of the very school where that patience had first been extended to her felt like the least she could do to repay it. It was Principal Ford, in fact, who finally made it possible. Learning of Mrs. Whitfield's 40-year-old unfinished promise during a casual conversation about the retirement dinner planning, she had quietly reached out to Shaq's foundation months earlier, explaining the situation in a short, respectful email, never expecting much of a response. She had written it late one evening after a school board meeting, uncertain whether it would even reach a real person, closing the email simply with, "I understand this is a long shot, but Mrs. Whitfield has given this school 43 years, and I would very much like to help her finish what she started." Dana Whitfield, Shaq's assistant, no relation to Eleanor despite the coincidence of surnames that made her pause when she first read the email, had brought it to Shaq's attention immediately, sensing, correctly, that this was not an invitation he would want buried under a stack of routine correspondence. Which is exactly how Shaquille O'Neal came to be standing in a decorated gymnasium on a Thursday night in November, holding a piece of paper he had written and completely forgotten, 40 years and 1 month after the day he wrote it. Dana had done her own quiet research in the weeks leading up to the dinner, not because Shaq had asked her to investigate anything suspicious, but simply because she had learned, over years of working for him, that the fuller a story's context, the more meaningfully he was able to show up for it. She started with the district's own archived newsletters, dry administrative documents that occasionally, buried in their back pages, mentioned notable classroom traditions worth highlighting for the community. She found 2 brief mentions of Mrs. Whitfield's letter assignment across the decades, one from 1994 and another from 2011, each describing it only in the vaguest terms, careful never to name specific students or specific letters. From there, Dana moved to local news archives, searching combinations of Rosedale Junior High, letter assignment, and 8th grade tradition, eventually surfacing a short human interest segment a local station had run nearly 8 years earlier during a slow news week, featuring 3 former students describing how a mysterious anonymous letter, read aloud by their teacher, had shaped the course of their lives. The segment never named Mrs. Whitfield directly by full context, referring to her only as a longtime Rosedale educator, but the details matched precisely. Dana watched the segment 3 times, pausing at one point on a close-up of an older woman standing in a classroom doorway, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, unmistakably Eleanor Whitfield, though the segment never printed her name on screen at her own quiet request. She sat back from her laptop after the 3rd viewing, feeling, she later told Shaq, like she had stumbled onto something considerably larger than a simple background check for a dinner invitation. What she found surprised even her. Eleanor Whitfield's Letter to Your Future Self assignment, it turned out, had become something of a quiet legend within the district over 4 decades. Mentioned in local newspaper features twice, referenced in her own retirement announcement, remembered fondly by an entire generation of Rosedale alumni who now, as adults, sometimes brought their own children back to visit her classroom just to see the famous locked drawer. Dana learned that Mrs. Whitfield had, over the years, developed a companion tradition alongside the letters themselves. Each October, after collecting the new letters, she would read aloud, anonymously, without ever naming the student, a single anonymized excerpt from a letter written by a student from years past, chosen carefully each year to speak to whatever struggles she sensed moving quietly through that particular class. There was one excerpt, Dana discovered through interviews with several now adult former students, that Mrs. Whitfield had read aloud more than any other, nearly every single year, for almost 4 decades, always introduced the same simple way. This was written by a student who once felt like he didn't fit anywhere in this world. I think some of you might understand that feeling. Dana sat very still after making that discovery, understanding immediately, before she had even confirmed it. exactly whose handwriting that excerpt had come from. She closed her laptop for a moment, walked to her kitchen window, and stood there for several minutes, simply letting the realization settle, before returning to her desk to keep building the fuller picture Shaq deserved to see before he ever set foot inside that gymnasium. She brought her findings to Shaq 2 days before the dinner, sitting across from him at his kitchen table with a folder of notes and a short list of names, former students who had specifically credited that anonymous excerpt with changing the direction of their lives. She had debated, on the drive over, exactly how much to share before the dinner itself, worried that too much preparation might rob the moment of something important, but ultimately decided he deserved to walk into that gymnasium with at least some understanding of what he might be about to encounter. "I want to be careful how I say this," Dana began, setting the folder down but keeping her hand resting on top of it. "This isn't just about one old assignment, Shaq. I think what I found is bigger than that. I think you should sit down before I go through it." She had spent the drive over rehearsing exactly how to introduce it, aware that whatever she said next would likely change how he walked into that gymnasium 2 days later, and wanting, above all, to give him the full truth gently rather than let him discover pieces of it in the middle of a crowded room. Shaq pulled out the chair across from her and sat, recognizing, from years of working together, the particular tone in her voice that meant the coming conversation deserved his full attention. "There's a firefighter in San Antonio named Dominic Reyes," Dana said quietly, 45 years old now. "He's told this story publicly more than once, at department events, in a local news interview a few years back. He said an anonymous letter his 8th grade teacher read aloud one October, about a kid who felt too big for the world around him, was the first time he ever believed someone like him could grow into someone who mattered. He was being bullied badly that year, Shaq. He said that excerpt was the reason he didn't drop out of school at 15. Shaq sat with that for a long moment, his coffee cooling untouched in front of him. "There's also a nurse," Dana continued gently. "Priya Anand, 38, works in the emergency department at a hospital downtown. She wrote about it in a college application essay years ago, about how the same excerpt, read to her own 8th grade class, was the first time she understood that feeling out of place wasn't a life sentence, just a chapter. And there's a teacher," Dana said, saving this one for last. "Jamal Booker, 29 years old, teaches 5th grade 2 districts over now. He said Mrs. Whitfield's tradition, and that specific excerpt especially, is the whole reason he became a teacher himself. He does the exact same letter assignment with his own students now, every October, without ever knowing where the tradition originally came from." Shaq closed his eyes for a long moment. "That was my letter," he said quietly, not really a question. "I believe so," Dana said. "I haven't confirmed the exact wording, obviously. Only Mrs. Whitfield has that. But everything lines up, Shaq. Timing, the description of the student, all of it. 40 years, Shaq said slowly, almost to himself. "Something I wrote when I was 14 years old, about feeling like I didn't fit anywhere, has been quietly changing kids' lives in a classroom I don't even remember clearly, for 4 decades, and I never knew any of it was happening. I don't think that's a coincidence," Dana said gently. "I think that's just how the good ones travel, quietly, for a long time, before anybody connects all the dots." Which brings us back to the gymnasium, to a folded piece of paper unfolding for the first time in 40 years, to 8 seconds of complete silence, and to the words Shaquille O'Neal finally read on that page, alone at a table surrounded by people who had no idea what they were witnessing. The letter in full read like this, in the uneven, earnest cursive of a 14-year-old boy who had already learned, far too young, what it felt like to take up more space in a room than anyone around him knew what to do with. The handwriting slanted slightly to the right, pressed hard enough into the page in places that the pencil had nearly torn through, the particular pressure of someone writing something they meant with their whole young heart. "Dear future me," it began. "I hope by the time you read this, you're not as scared of being different as I am right now. I hope people stopped staring by then, or maybe I just stopped caring so much what the staring means. Mama says the world is still catching up to me. I hope she's right. I hope by the time you read this, you found a way to make being different feel less lonely for somebody else, the way I wish somebody had done for me this year. I hope you're still kind, even to the kids who aren't kind to you. Because Sergeant Harrison says how you treat people who treat you badly. That's who you really are. I hope you remember this year, even the hard parts, because I think it's teaching me something I'm going to need later, even if I don't understand it yet." Shaq read every line twice before he lowered the page, his hands still holding it carefully, his eyes wet in a way he did not try to hide from the small circle of people who had by now gone quiet at the table around him. "I told my future self to make being different feel less lonely for somebody else," he said softly, looking up at Eleanor Whitfield. "I built an entire life around that sentence, and I completely forgot I ever wrote it." "That happens more than you'd think," Eleanor said gently. "The words we write when we're young and scared have a way of becoming the compass we follow, without ever remembering we drew the map ourselves." "Read it to me again," Shaq said quietly, holding the page back out toward her. "The part about Sergeant Harrison. I want to hear it in your voice, the way your students must have heard it all those years." Eleanor took the page carefully, put on her reading glasses, and read the line aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving through her. "I hope you're still kind, even to the kids who aren't kind to you, because Sergeant Harrison says how you treat people who treat you badly. That's who you really are." Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, listening to his own 14-year-old words carried in someone else's voice, exactly the way thousands of students across 4 decades must have first heard them. Eleanor Whitfield finally sat down in the folding chair beside him, her own eyes glistening behind her reading glasses. "I read that excerpt out loud to my students almost every single October for 39 years, Mr. O'Neill," she said quietly. "I never told a single one of them whose words those were. I just told them somebody once felt exactly the way they were feeling, and grew into somebody who found a way to make that feeling matter for good, instead of letting it stay a wound." Shaq stared at her for a long moment. "You've been reading my letter to your students for almost 40 years, he said slowly, "and I had no idea any of it was happening. I didn't know how to tell you," she admitted. "I didn't know how to reach you, and then I didn't know if it would be right to reach you, and the years just kept passing. I told myself, every single October, that this would be the year I finally found a way. It took me a very long time to keep that promise to myself." "But wait," Dana said quietly, stepping closer to the table, sensing this was the moment. "Mrs. Whitfield, there's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told him yet." Everyone at the table turned toward her. Dana had said little throughout the exchange, watching carefully, and something in the careful way Eleanor Whitfield had been holding her handbag throughout the conversation, one hand resting protectively over its clasp, had told Dana there was more to this story than a single returned letter. Eleanor Whitfield was silent for a moment, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap. Then she reached back into her small black handbag and withdrew a second piece of paper, this one newer, though still worn soft at its folds, clearly handled many times over many years. "I made a photocopy," she admitted softly, unfolding the second page carefully as she spoke, her hands betraying the smallest tremor now for the first time all evening. "Before I locked the original away. I know I shouldn't have. It felt like keeping something that wasn't fully mine to keep. But I was 29 years old that year, Mr. O'Neill, in only my 4th year of teaching, and I was seriously considering leaving the profession altogether. It was a hard year," she continued. "I had a difficult class, difficult administration, a principal who made it clear he didn't think I was cut out for this work. I had already written a letter of resignation. It was sitting in my desk drawer, the same drawer where I kept the letters, right beside your original. That principal used to sit in on my lessons unannounced," she said, a flicker of old hurt crossing her face even now. "He'd stand in the back with a clipboard, marking things down, telling me afterward that I let my students talk too much, that a good classroom should be quieter than mine ever was. I started to believe him. I started to think maybe I really wasn't built for this. I remember exactly where I was sitting that night," she continued. "This same building, a different classroom back then, grading essays under a single desk lamp because the overhead lights in that wing shut off automatically at 9. I had the resignation letter typed and printed, just waiting for morning. The night before I planned to turn that resignation letter in," she said, her voice thickening, "I stayed late grading papers, and I found myself rereading some of that year's letters one more time, trying to remind myself why any of this mattered. And I read yours again. That line about hoping to make being different feel less lonely for somebody else. And I thought, if a 14-year-old boy who was having the hardest year of his life could still write something that generous, something that hopeful, then maybe I owed it to kids like him to stay in that classroom a little longer. I remember sitting there for almost an hour after that," she continued, "just holding your letter in my hands, rereading it, arguing with myself. Part of me still believed the principal, still believed I wasn't cut out for this work. But another part of me kept thinking about you, sitting in that back corner desk, clearly carrying something heavy that year, and still finding it in yourself to hope for something generous. I thought, if I leave now, who's going to be in that room for the next kid like him? I tore up my resignation letter that night, she said quietly. I photocopied yours instead, so I'd always have it close, in case I ever needed reminding again. And some years, Mr. O'Neill, I needed reminding a great deal. Shaq sat very still, absorbing this. You almost quit, he said slowly, and something I wrote when I was 14 years old is the reason you didn't. I taught for 39 more years after that night, Eleanor Whitfield said. I estimate, roughly, that means somewhere close to 5,000 students passed through my classroom in the years that followed. I think about that number sometimes, Mr. O'Neill. 5,000 children, taught by a woman who very nearly walked away, kept in that room by 11 sentences a 14-year-old boy wrote to himself on an October afternoon in 1986. That principal retired himself a few years after that, she added, a small, dry smile crossing her face. I outlasted him by nearly 35 years. I think about that sometimes too. Nobody at the table spoke for a long moment. The gymnasium's ambient noise, chairs scraping, distant laughter, the low hum of 100 quiet conversations, seemed to recede into the background. Even Coach Marsh, rarely at a loss for words, sat quietly turning his water glass in slow circles on the tablecloth, absorbing the full weight of what had just been shared. Shaq reached across the small distance between their chairs and took Eleanor Whitfield's hand in both of his enormous ones, holding it gently, carefully, the way a person holds something they suddenly understand to be far more fragile and far more important than they had realized a moment earlier. Thank you, he said quietly, for staying. Thank you, she said back, her voice barely steady, for writing something worth staying for. Principal Ford, who had been quietly wiping her own eyes throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Mrs. Whitfield, she said softly, I think I finally understand something I've wondered about for years. You always seemed to know exactly when a struggling teacher needed to hear that this work mattered. I always assumed it was just instinct. I never knew you were pulling from your own hardest year to do it. Instinct and experience aren't always different things, Eleanor said, smiling gently at her former mentee turned principal. Sometimes the instinct is just experience you've stopped remembering the source of. Coach Delvin Marsh, still seated at the table, cleared his throat and spoke up for the first time since the paper had been unfolded. I remember you that year, he said quietly, looking at Shaq. You were the tallest kid I'd ever coached at that age, and also about the gentlest. I used to worry the other boys would take advantage of that gentleness. I never once saw you throw the first punch, even when you had every reason to. Sergeant Harrison wouldn't have allowed it, Shaq said, a small smile breaking through. He used to say fighting fair was easy. Fighting kind was the hard part. Coach Marsh laughed softly, shaking his head. I coached a lot of talented kids over the years, he said, but I don't think I ever coached one with a stronger sense of who he wanted to be than you had at 14. Reading that letter just now, I understand why. Word of the moment did not travel through cameras or social media that night. There were no phones raised, no video capturing the exchange. It traveled the way meaningful things traveled at Rosedale Junior High, quietly, through the people who happened to witness it, carried home in conversation, repeated at kitchen tables across San Antonio in the days that followed. Principal Ford told her husband about it that same night, still visibly moved as she recounted it over a late dinner. Coach Marsh mentioned it briefly to his wife, who had taught alongside Eleanor decades earlier, and who cried quietly at their own kitchen table upon hearing the details. Shaq called his mother from the car that night before the drive back to his hotel, still holding the folded letter carefully in his lap like something that might dissolve if handled roughly. Mama, he said when she picked up, you're not going to believe what happened tonight. He told her everything. The folded paper, the 8 seconds of silence, Eleanor Whitfield's 40-year promise, and finally, the line about Sergeant Harrison that had been read aloud to thousands of students across 4 decades without any of them ever knowing whose father's wisdom they were actually hearing. His mother was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. Philip would be so proud to know his words traveled that far, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. He always said the things you teach a child don't stay contained to just that one child. I don't think even he understood, back then, exactly how true that would turn out to be. I wish he could have known, Shaq said quietly. Maybe he does, his mother said. Maybe that's exactly the kind of thing a person gets to find out, eventually. After hanging up, Shaq sat alone in his hotel room for a long while. The letter unfolded flat on the small desk in front of him, under the glow of a single lamp. He read it through twice more, slowly, letting each line settle in a way the 8 seconds in the gymnasium hadn't given him room to do. He noticed things on the second and third readings he had missed in the initial shock of it. Small details, only visible once the surprise had worn down enough to let him actually see the page clearly. A tiny ink smudge near the bottom margin, where a 14-year-old hand had rested too long against wet ink. A single crossed-out word near the middle of the second paragraph, the only edit on the entire page, where he had apparently started to write something else before changing his mind. He wondered, staring at that crossed-out word for a long moment, what he had almost written instead, and why some 14-year-old instinct had decided the second version was truer. He held the page up closer to the lamp, tilting it slightly, trying and failing to make out the word beneath the careful, deliberate scratch marks, whatever earlier, less hopeful version of himself had once decided wasn't worth keeping. He thought about all the versions of himself that had existed in the 40 years since that page was written, all the championships and disappointments and quiet ordinary Tuesdays that had passed without him ever once thinking about this particular piece of paper. And yet here it was, having waited patiently the entire time, carrying exactly the same hope forward, without needing him to remember it in order to keep being true. He texted Dana just after midnight, unable to sleep, though he kept the message simple, still thinking about tonight. "Thank you for finding this before I walked in blind." Dana wrote back within a few minutes, clearly still awake herself. "That's the job," she wrote. "But honestly, Shaq, this one's going to stay with me for a long time too." He set his phone down and looked at the letter one more time before finally turning off the lamp, the folded page resting carefully on the nightstand beside him where he could see it. A small, faded, impossibly important piece of paper that had somehow waited 40 years just to remind him who he'd already decided to become. 2 days later, Shaq asked Dana to arrange a private meeting with Dominic Reyes, Priya Anand, and Jamal Booker, the 3 former students whose lives had been shaped, without their knowledge, by his own forgotten words. They met at a small conference room at the district office, plain beige walls, a long table surrounded by rolling office chairs, a pitcher of water sweating gently in the middle of the table. Eleanor Whitfield seated at the head of the table, having insisted on being present for what she called the last chapter of a very long assignment. The 3 former students had arrived early, each visibly nervous in the small waiting area outside, none of them quite believing the phone call they had each received 2 days earlier inviting them to this exact room. Dominic had come straight from a shift, still in half his uniform. Priya had traded shifts with a colleague to be there. Jamal had arranged a substitute for his own classroom for the afternoon. While they waited, the 3 of them fell into easy conversation, comparing which years they'd each had Mrs. Whitfield, trading small memories of her classroom, the reading corner with its beanbag chairs, the way she always kept a jar of butterscotch candies on her desk for anyone who needed one during a hard week. None of them had known each other well as students, separated by several years between their respective 8th grade classes, and yet they found themselves talking like old friends within minutes, bound together by a shared teacher and a shared, if previously anonymous, letter. Dana, sitting quietly near the door managing the meeting's logistics, made a note to herself that afternoon, watching the 3 of them together, that this was exactly the kind of ripple effect that never made it into any spreadsheet. 3 strangers, connected across 15 years of age difference, sitting together like family in a beige conference room because of 11 sentences a scared 14-year-old boy had once written to himself. Dominic Reyes, 45 years old, still built like the athlete he had been in his youth, sat across from Shaq with his firefighter's cap resting on the table in front of him. "I've told that story so many times," he said, shaking his head slowly, "about the letter Mrs. Whitfield read us. I never once imagined I'd get to meet the person who wrote it. I was being bullied pretty badly that year," Dominic continued, his voice steady but carrying old weight. "Kids can be cruel about anything different, and I was different in about 4 different ways that year. When she read that letter, about a boy who felt too big for the world around him, something in me just cracked open a little. I remember thinking, if he could still hope for something better, maybe I could too. There was a kid named Ricky Solis who used to wait for me by the buses every afternoon," Dominic continued, his jaw tightening slightly at the memory. "I used to take the long way around just to avoid him. I never told anybody, Not even my own parents, how bad that year actually was. But I told Mrs. Whitfield's letter, in a way. Writing my own letter that October, knowing somebody would read a piece of it out loud to future classes, made me feel like maybe my hard year could still turn into something useful for somebody else, even if I never met them. "You're a firefighter now," Shaq said quietly. "You run into the exact situations everyone else runs away from." "I think about that letter every single time," Dominic admitted. "Making being different feel less lonely for somebody else. That's basically the whole job, when you think about it." Priya Anand, 38, sat with her hands folded neatly on the table, an ID badge from the hospital still clipped to her scrubs from an early shift that morning. "I wrote about that excerpt in my nursing school application essay," she said, smiling faintly at the memory. "I didn't even fully understand until this moment that it was your handwriting behind it." "My family moved to San Antonio from Houston the summer before 8th grade, Priya continued. "I didn't know anybody. My English wasn't as strong as the other kids back then, and I was terrified every single day that year of being called on in class and getting something wrong. Mrs. Whitfield's classroom was the first place I actually felt like it was safe to be new somewhere. And that letter she read us, about feeling too big or too different for the room around you, it was the first time I understood that other people, even people who looked completely confident from the outside, had felt exactly the same fear I was carrying." "What did you write?" Shaq asked gently. "That the letter taught me feeling out of place wasn't the end of my story," Priya said. "Just an early chapter. I hold on to that every single shift, especially the hard ones, when a scared patient reminds me of how scared I felt that whole year." Jamal Booker, 29, the youngest at the table, had been quiet through most of the conversation, visibly moved. "I teach 5th grade now," he finally said. "I do the exact same letter assignment with my own students every October. I always thought it was just something I made up on my own, inspired by Mrs. Whitfield. I had no idea I was actually continuing something that started with you." "Why 5th grade?" Shaq asked. "Why teaching at all?" Jamal considered the question carefully before answering. "I was actually pre-med for 2 years in college," he admitted. "I had a whole plan. But I kept coming back to that letter, the anonymous one Mrs. Whitfield read us, about not letting your differentness stay a wound. I realized somewhere in my 2nd year that what I actually wanted to do with my life was be the person handing kids that same kind of hope, not just once a year, but every single day, in whatever small ways a 5th grade classroom allows for. I switched my major that spring." "Your students are lucky to have you," Shaq said quietly. "I think about that every October," Jamal said, "when I hand out the blank paper and watch them start writing. I have no idea whose life I might be changing 40 years from now, the same way Mrs. Whitfield had no idea, all those years ago, handing paper to a quiet kid in the back corner desk." "You're still doing it," Shaq said softly. "Right now. Kids in your classroom are writing letters to their future selves because of something that started in this exact building 40 years ago." "I guess I am," Jamal said, smiling through sudden tears. "I guess we all are, in our own way." Eleanor Whitfield watched the 4 of them from the head of the table, her own eyes wet, witnessing, in a single conference room, the full and complete shape of a promise she had first made to a room full of 14-year-olds decades before any of them were born. In the weeks that followed, Shaq worked quietly with Dana and the district's foundation office to establish something new, something that would carry the tradition forward rather than simply commemorate it. They met at Eleanor Whitfield's own kitchen table for the planning sessions, at her insistence, saying she'd spent 43 years having meetings in beige conference rooms and would prefer for this particular project to do it somewhere that smelled like coffee instead of dry erase markers. The planning took the better part of a month. Dana handled logistics, budget lines, and coordination with each district's curriculum office. Eleanor insisted on writing the program's guiding materials herself, a short instructional booklet for participating teachers explaining not just the mechanics of the letter assignment, but the philosophy behind it. Drawn from 4 decades of watching exactly how much a small kept promise could matter to a struggling teenager. "You have to tell the teachers the truth about how long this might take," Eleanor insisted during one planning session, tapping the draft booklet with one finger. "Some of these letters won't find their way home for 10, 20, even 40 years. That has to be all right. That has to be part of the promise from the very beginning, or the whole thing falls apart the first time it gets inconvenient." "I'll make sure it's the first page," Dana said, making a note. "Good," Eleanor said, satisfied. Patience was always the hardest part of this work. Harder than the paperwork, harder than difficult parents, harder than any of it. You're asking a teacher to plant something they may never personally see bloom. That takes a particular kind of faith. They called it the Whitfield Future Self Project, funding the letter-writing tradition, along with basic classroom supplies and a small library of encouraging literature, in 12 underserved schools across 3 districts, with plans to expand each year going forward. Eleanor Whitfield, true to form, insisted the program not carry Shaq's name. This was never about who wrote which letter, she told him firmly, during the planning meeting where the program's structure was finalized. It's about making sure every kid gets the chance to hope for something better, and the chance, someday, to have that hope handed back to them. In its first year, the Whitfield Future Self Project reached over 3,000 students across 12 schools. Teachers reported, almost universally, that the assignment became one of the most anticipated days of the school year, students taking the exercise seriously in a way few other assignments managed to inspire. At Sam Rayburn Elementary, one of the 12 participating schools, a 5th grade teacher named Mrs. Alvarez reported that a notoriously withdrawn student in her class, a boy who rarely completed any written assignment at all, filled 2 full pages for the letter exercise, later telling her privately that it was the first time in the school year he'd written something nobody was going to grade him on being good enough at. At a 3rd school, a small alternative high school serving students who had struggled in traditional classroom settings, a teacher named Mr. Okonkwo adapted the project for older students, asking them to write not just to their future selves, but to include one piece of advice for whoever might read their letter decades later without ever knowing them personally. One student's letter, shared anonymously with permission at a district training session the following spring, read simply, "Whoever you turn out to be, thank you for not giving up on the kid who wrote this." The room of assembled teachers, Dana later told Shaq, had gone completely silent after it was read aloud. At a middle school 2 counties over, a school counselor began using excerpts from anonymized student letters, with permission, as discussion prompts in her small group sessions for students struggling with anxiety. Finding that hearing a peer's hope, even an anonymous one, opened conversations that direct questioning rarely could. Dominic Reyes began volunteering 1 afternoon a month, visiting classrooms to talk about resilience and firefighting, and the letter that changed his life, never naming its author unless a student asked directly, honoring the same anonymity Eleanor Whitfield had always maintained. During one visit, a student asked him bluntly whether he still felt like the scared kid from his own letter. He thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Some days," he admitted, "but now I know what to do with that feeling instead of just carrying it around alone." Priya Anand started a small tradition of her own at the hospital, keeping a folder of encouraging notes from grateful patients that she read on especially hard shifts. A direct echo, she told Shaq once, of the folder Eleanor Whitfield had kept locked in her desk for 4 decades. Jamal Booker's own students, the following October, wrote letters that would be locked away in his own classroom drawer, the tradition now officially 2 generations removed from where it began, with no sign of stopping. 1 year later, on a warm Tuesday afternoon in October of 2027, Shaq returned to Rosedale Junior High, this time not for a formal dinner but for an ordinary school day, invited by Jamal Booker's former 8th grade classroom, now taught by a young teacher named Miss Ortiz who had taken over Eleanor Whitfield's old room after her retirement. He had made the trip a standing yearly commitment, blocking off the 2nd Tuesday of every October on his calendar, the same way he blocked off holidays with his own family, a small, private tradition that had quietly become one of the most important dates on his schedule. The classroom looked much the same as it must have looked 41 years earlier. Desks arranged in careful rows, a chalkboard along one wall, autumn light filtering through tall windows. A new locked drawer, purchased specifically for this purpose, sat built into the teacher's desk at the front of the room. Miss Ortiz, 26 years old and only in her 3rd year of teaching, had inherited more than just a classroom when she took over for Eleanor Whitfield. She had spent an entire afternoon that summer sitting with Eleanor at her kitchen table, taking careful notes as the older woman explained, in detail, exactly how the letter tradition worked, what to say when introducing it each October, how to store the letters safely, and, most importantly, how to be patient enough to wait, sometimes years, for the right moment to return them. Eleanor had made tea for both of them that afternoon, the same chipped floral teapot she'd used for decades, and the 2 women had talked for nearly 4 hours, well past the point where the notes alone would have sufficed. She told me the letters weren't really about the writing, Ms. Ortiz said to Shaq quietly, watching her students work. She said they were about proving to a kid, at some unknown point years down the road, that somebody had been paying enough attention to keep a promise. I think about that every single time I lock this drawer. Eleanor Whitfield sat in a chair near the back, 82 years old now, fully retired, invited as a guest of honor for the occasion. She watched, smiling quietly, as a new class of 14-year-olds bent over their notebook paper, pencils moving carefully, writing letters to people they had not yet become. Before the assignment began, a few students clustered curiously around Shaq's chair, peppering him with questions that had little to do with letters or teachers, the ordinary curious questions kids ask a very tall stranger in their classroom. How tall are you exactly? Did your feet ever stop growing? Could he still dunk? He answered each one patiently, crouching down slightly to bring himself closer to their eye level, laughing along with them, letting the room settle into an easy comfort before the more serious part of the visit began. Shaq stood at the front of the room for a few minutes before the assignment began, ducking automatically beneath the doorframe as he entered, and told the students, briefly, about a letter he had written in this very building 41 years earlier, about how he had completely forgotten writing it, and about how it had somehow found its way back to him exactly when it needed to. I don't know what any of you are going to write today, he told them, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. But I want you to know, whatever you're hoping to become, it matters. Somebody might be holding on to your words for a very long time, waiting for exactly the right moment to hand them back to you. A girl in the third row, maybe 13 years old, raised her hand shyly. Did you know Mrs. Whitfield kept your letter that whole time? She asked. Shaq smiled, glancing toward the back of the room where Eleanor Whitfield sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching this new chapter unfold in the same room where the whole story had first begun. No, he said softly. I had no idea. I think that might be the whole point. The best promises are the ones you don't even know are being kept until the exact moment you need them most. A boy near the window, quieter than the others, raised his hand next. What if what we write doesn't come true? He asked, his voice small. Shaq considered the question seriously, the way he considered most questions from kids, never rushing past them the way adults sometimes rushed past the things that mattered most to a child. I don't think that's really what these letters are for, he said. I wrote that I hoped I'd stop being scared of being different. I'm not sure I ever fully stopped, but I found a way to use that feeling instead of just carrying it. Sometimes the letter isn't a prediction, it's just a compass. It doesn't tell you exactly where you'll end up. It just helps you notice which direction you're already leaning. The boy nodded slowly, seeming to turn that answer over in his mind, and bent back down to finish his own letter. After the students finished their letters, sealing them carefully into envelopes with their names written on the front, Ms. Ortiz locked them, one by one, into the new drawer built into her desk. The same quiet ritual that had now spanned 2 teachers, 2 classrooms, and more than 4 decades. Eleanor Whitfield approached Shaq before he left that afternoon, walking slowly across the same classroom floor she had crossed thousands of times over her career. 43 years of teaching, she said quietly. And I think this might be my favorite ending of all of them. It's not an ending, Shaq said, smiling down at her. It's just the part where the drawer gets locked again. They walked together out to the school parking lot, matching each other's slow pace, the afternoon sun low and golden over the same lawn Eleanor had watched thousands of students cross over 4 decades. A few parents waiting in cars for pickup glanced curiously at the unlikely pair. An 82-year-old woman in a cardigan walking beside a man who stood nearly 2 feet taller than she did. Somewhere behind them, a school bus pulled away from the curb with a soft hydraulic sigh, and the late afternoon light caught the dust motes drifting above the parking lot in slow, lazy spirals. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said, stopping beside her car, a modest sedan she had driven for the past 12 years. That last line in your letter, the one about hoping you'd remember this year, even the hard parts, because you thought it was teaching you something you'd need later. Do you know now what it was teaching you? Shaq thought about the question for a long moment, watching a group of students walk past toward the bus loop, backpacks slung over their shoulders, laughing about something none of the adults could hear. I think it taught me that the hardest years are usually the ones doing the most quiet work on you, he said finally. You don't feel it happening at the time. You just feel like you're surviving. It's only looking back, sometimes decades later, that you realize you are actually becoming something. Eleanor's eyes filled again, and she reached up, remarkably, to pat his enormous forearm the way she must have once patted the shoulders of countless 14-year-olds walking out of her classroom for the very last time. "That," she said softly, "is exactly the answer I always hoped that letter was teaching somebody." She got into her car, rolled down the window, and looked up at him one more time before pulling away. "Thank you for coming back," she said, "both today and 40 years ago, in your own way." Shaq stood in the parking lot for a long moment after her car disappeared around the corner, the folded letters still tucked safely in his jacket pocket, before ducking into his own car and heading back toward the highway. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is sitting in a classroom, or a quiet bedroom, or a hospital waiting room, writing words they will not fully understand the weight of for years, maybe decades. This story is a reminder that hope, even hope written in uneven 14-year-old cursive, does not expire. Sometimes it simply waits, locked safely away, for the exact right moment to travel back to the person who needs it most. And sometimes the person keeping that hope safe is quietly saving their own life in the process, one locked drawer, one kept promise, at a time. There is a version of this story where Eleanor Whitfield gives up on teaching after that hard fourth year, where the resignation letter goes in instead of the essay, where 5,000 students never meet her at all, where Dominic Reyes drops out at 15, where Priya Anand never becomes the nurse a scared patient needs at 3 in the morning, where Jamal Booker becomes a doctor instead of a teacher, and an entirely different set of 5th graders never learn to write letters to their own future selves. All of that rests, impossibly, on 11 sentences a frightened 14-year-old boy wrote almost by accident on an October afternoon, never imagining anyone but himself would ever read them. That is, perhaps, the truest thing this story has to offer. We rarely know, in the moment, which of our smallest, most private words might end up carrying the most weight. We simply have to keep writing them, kindly and honestly, and trust the rest to arrive exactly when it needs to. Maybe you are the one carrying an old promise right now, something you hoped for once and forgot you ever wrote down. If that's you, this story is a reminder that it is never too late for those words to find their way back to you, exactly when you need them. Before you go, drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one, and we love knowing how far these stories travel around the world. And if this story moved you even a little, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps this story reach somebody out there who might need to be reminded that their own hope is still worth keeping. And if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes the smallest kept promises are often the ones that matter most. Somewhere in San Antonio tonight, a locked drawer sits inside a classroom desk, holding this year's letters, waiting patiently the way drawers like it have waited for over 4 decades now, for exactly the right October, exactly the right graduate, exactly the right moment to open again. Share this video with one person today, just one, because that's exactly how a locked drawer full of hope keeps traveling. One kept promise, one classroom, one generation at a time. Now click on the video appearing on your screen right now, because the next story we have for you is just as powerful as this one. We will see you there.